PTSD is the cause of one military suicide in the UK per week. Our next guest on the podcast is Andy Shaw. Now, Andy actually served in the Royal Marines and was deployed in the Falklands War. He was on the ground fighting. He was also deployed in Northern Ireland when the troubles were ongoing. Within this podcast, he speaks extensively about the war, about how harrowing that was, but also about the incident that changed everything for him, the blue on blue. This blue on blue, or friendly fire incident, was actually a catalyst for something that is a huge issue in society nowadays. This was the catalyst for his PTSD. Through a long period of suffering and self-discovery, and eventually discovering that he himself had PTSD, he decided to turn his life around, and he decided to make his purpose in life to help others struggling with PTSD. This moment then led to Andy founding the Mountain Way charity. Now, the Mountain Way charity actually helps veterans that are suffering with PTSD and helps them overcome that huge hurdle in their life. The Mountain Way charity is extremely unique in its approach to PTSD, and I think that's why it's so transformational within people that struggle with this affliction. On that journey through Mountain Way, you get to spend one-on-one time with Andy. You go hikes, you go through a journey of self-discovery. And through that journey of self-discovery, you'll hopefully come to terms with your affliction. Now, if you know anyone that's struggling with PTSD, or you yourself are struggling with PTSD, then please consider hitting the link below and seeing what he has to offer. My name is Harrison Brown, and this is the Into the Moon podcast. If you're watching or listening, I hope this helps. So much I want to cover with you, from Royal Marines to the charity, Mountain Way charity, to PTSD, to mental health amongst Marines. I think where to start is at the start. So when did you get into the Marine Corps and when did you join the Royal Marines?
5th of October 1976.
Very specific.
You don't forget these dates.
Yeah.
Like your regimental number and things like that, they're welded in there permanently.
Yeah. And what was your first kind of interaction? Was it training straight away? What drew you to the military?
I suppose an act of desperation. That's probably a bit too much. But my love of my life had walked off. I was a coalman in Saltash. My parents paid for me to go to 2 boarding schools. I ran away to sea with 1 O-level. I started to feel I'd let them down a bit. And I thought I need to sort myself out. And I thought, well, I'll join the army. So I went along to the careers office in Plymouth, Mayflower Street, and all career offices are in the same street. Mm-hmm. And I walked into the Army careers office not knowing anything about it. And I was looking through these leaflets, how to be a driver, how to be a chef and all this sort of stuff. Where's the bit about fighting? I couldn't find anything about that, you know. Yeah. And if anybody come up to me and said, do you want to be in the Army, son? I'd have been a Pongo. But nobody did. So I walked out a bit disillusioned. Went past the RAF one, because if you can't fly Spitfires, there's no point being in the RAF. Mm-hmm. And I got to the Navy, and I'd been at sea for 6 years already in the merchant Navy and the fishing industry, so I wasn't keen on going back to sea. But there was a poster in the window that caught my eye, and I knew it was Norway because I'd been up in the Arctic for about 3 years on trawlers. And there was a small boat that had come literally up the beach. It had come out of the water, you could see the wash. And there was all these guys with this white gear and these green berets on and guns leaping out of this thing. And I thought, that's a strange thing for Matlers to be doing. And while I was looking at it, some old colour sergeant looked over the top and he sort of went, come on in, for a wet. So that was it. So I walked in. So he said, so you want to be a Royal Marine? What's a Royal Marine? I'd never heard of them. Yeah. He said, Britain's Commandos? We've got commandos. I didn't know that. Right, sit down there, son, watch this. Then he said to me, NATO? Yeah. NATO? What do you mean NATO? NATO. Milk and 2 sugars. Oh, right. Yeah, okay. Yes, please. So I got one of these things. Yeah. And I watched the film, and 20 minutes later, I want to be that. That was it. Yeah. And I joined up. I waited about 3 months, and then on the 5th of October, I turned up at Lympstone, and we just went straight into it. But I turned up looking like this, and there was some confusion. They thought I was a potential officer, when in fact I was just a recruit. Yeah. And the training team weren't sure how to deal with me, and my contemporaries thought I was a plant, because I was 22, whereas most of them were sort of 17. But we got over that hurdle and cracked on. 6 months training, which is still the same today. In fact, I think it's got a bit longer. And at the end of which, if you pass out, you're now qualified as a Royal Marine Commando. And then you get sent to your units. And I was sent up here to Scotland to Arbroath, to our 4-5 Commando.
And you talk about making your sort of trying to prove your parents wrong and try to make something of yourself. You actually won or earned the Kingsman badge and then the year after, the Sword of Honor.
That's more or less right. Yeah, the King's Badge.
Yeah.
King George V awarded this after the 4th Battalion Royal Marine Light Infantry did their famous raid at a place called Zeebrugge during the First World War. It was to block the canals because the German U-boats were using them as a base, and it was a very bloody action. And the VCs were awarded by ballot. There was so much heroism, nobody could make a decision. So he came down to Deal, which is where they were based at the time.
Yeah.
And he decreed that the best recruit in every troop going through training would be awarded the King's Badge. And it's got his cipher and it's worn on the left sleeve. And every troop, when they reach the end of training in the last 2 weeks, becomes what's called the King Squad. And this is usually when you go into your advanced sort of drill and prepare for the pass out and things like that. But not every troop has a King's Badgeman because there's a set standard. And some of them just don't come up to it. So that's what that is. The Sword of Honor, actually, it was more like 4 years later when I was commissioned. And every batch has a Sword of Honor winner. So there's a slight difference there because, it's not set to a certain standard. It's just set to the standard that they've applied at the time.
Yes.
I'm very proud of both of them. And this sounds like bragging, but as far as I'm aware, and I may be out of touch today, but as of a couple of years ago, I'm one of only 5 in the 360 year of the Corps that have been awarded both.
Wow.
So that's something I'm proud of.
It's something to be proud of.
Yeah.
And what do you think was different about you that got you to that place to earn those two?
Well, I think age helped a lot. I was 22 when I went through recruit training, and I was 26 when I became a young officer, second lieutenant, whereas my contemporaries were, quite a bit younger. So that definitely helped.
Yeah.
As far as the recruit thing's concerned, having been away from home, 2 boarding schools, the sea and all that, there was no problems with homesickness. Not that I saw it in any of my contemporaries either, but, I was well past all that. I'd obviously had a lot of experience outside of school and family.
Yeah.
So settling into the system was straightforward. But I didn't actually think in terms of I'm going for the King's Badge. I wasn't even aware of it. I don't think any of us were to start with. Training is so intense, you're focused on the next period.
Yeah.
And if you're really thinking long term, it's maybe next day. But that's about as far as it goes because you're rushing for 6 months. Officer training, obviously having been in the Corps for 4 years, I was a lot more aware of things, savvy and all that sort of stuff. But again, I didn't really think in terms of being the best. I just thought to myself, do your best.
Yeah.
And again, having had that experience as a Marine, and there were 2 others. There was known as Corps Commission. Most of the lads came directly in from outside, but there were 4 that had come across from the Navy who were midshipmen who joined us, and the rest, as I say, came from outside. There used to be 2 batch system in those days, so there was a May entry, which I was in. I was in Young Officer May 1980 batch, YM80.
Yeah.
And we were like the backstreet kids and, the rough end of the game.
Yeah.
The September crowd were all graduates, so much more intelligent and very smooth chaps and everything. That's what they thought anyway.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you need a bit
But we had a habit of beating them at the boxing and everything else,
Yeah.
because we're just nastier. And that's the way it was, So, I mean, those were the advantages, I think, really, to be honest.
Yeah. And how was training? Like, talk me through a day in training back when you were training for the Royal Marines.
Well, as a recruit, it's all new. Everything's new. So the advice to take one day at a time was the best advice of all, because 6 months seems like a very long time when you realise the tempo is pretty fast.
Yes.
I can't remember exactly when Reveille was, but I think breakfast would have been about 7:30. We'd have started about 8:30, I should think. But by then, your locker is immaculate, your bed is immaculate, your weapon is immaculate, you are immaculate, everything's immaculate. So what it often meant was you never actually slept in your bed. You slept in the corridor because the floor's polished like glass. Everything in the locker has to be identical. So you've got maybe 30, 40 recruits, and somehow or other, we've all got to have the same locker, and we're all in different rooms. I think we were 8-man rooms. Wow. So the coordination of that was quite a challenge.
Yeah.
And of course, there's always one biff in there that screws up for everybody else. As soon as that happens, you're in the River X, or you're in the static tank, or something like that. And sometimes you come back and all your kit is up the road. It's all been, the lockers emptied, everything out the window, the lot. That's why when we were issued the kit, everything was stamped with our names, so we could find it again. And you'd be retrieving your socks from a tree, or whatever. I mean, it's funny, it's comical, and it's obviously done to it's pressure, it's simple as that, And it's to break you down as an individual, and you're now part of a team, and you've got to work together and all that kind of stuff. It all makes complete sense, but when you're exposed to it for the first time, it's pretty harsh.
It's a shock.
And the failure rate is about 40%. And I don't know if that's the case today, but it's always been about 40%.
Wow.
Don't make it because of that pressure, really.
because you do see a lot of these Americanized films, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I might be watching too many movies, but where the sergeant is, shouting at the recruits, and if one person messes up, you're all, being punished for that mess up. Is that kind of the way it works?
The shouting side of life, well, I must admit I was a bit guilty of doing that myself when I became a trainer, but that was more with young officers, not with the recruits. I set higher standards for officers, and some of them actually needed it because they were a bit arrogant, but felt they knew it all, that sort of stuff. You've got to sort of knock that out of them a little bit, because you can't behave like that as a leader. You've got to lead by example. But with recruits, no. And certainly my own experience was training teams, and the Royal Marines generally, I think, pride themselves on this. You don't need to do that.
Yeah.
You can just talk quite normally to somebody and say, I'd like you to run to the top of that hill and back again. And by the way, you've got 2 minutes, go. Why shout?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, okay, it's a slight exaggeration, but no, it's not like the Americans at all. A very different culture, of course, and I wince. Not that I really make a habit of watching those films too much, because I'm beyond all that.
Yeah.
No, I think, there's a very gentlemanly, very mature attitude to this.
Yes.
But be under no illusion, if one person makes a mistake, it can cause the whole troop a problem.
Yeah.
The danger with that, though, is you end up with a sort of cliquey element where the troop will then turn on the individual, and that mustn't happen, of course. And it's like bullying, can't be condoned under any circumstances. So training teams have to be aware of, the implications of what they do. But broadly speaking, the training is sufficiently demanding enough. You don't need to add additional pressure like that. Sleep deprivation's not deliberate, but it just happens a matter of course.
Because you're up at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. every morning, is it?
Not necessarily every morning, but pretty most all of them. I mean, I think we work Saturday mornings as well.
Yeah.
So I think we had Saturday afternoon and Sunday off. But we weren't allowed ashore for quite a long time. So I forget what stage of training they said, right now as a leave pass, you can actually go out of the camp. Wow, go and meet civilians, have a drink, all that sort of stuff. Wonderful.
I'm guessing that was mental.
Well, again, you've got to be careful, I mean, I mean, everything was well controlled, but you didn't feel as if you were controlled. I felt personally as if I was a round peg in a round hole. At last, I'd found something that was not academically demanding. There was a requirement, of course. I mean, there were tests to prove your aptitude and so on. But you didn't need to have a great academic brain. You just needed to have a lot of determination, listen carefully to what you're told, do exactly what they say,
Yes.
and show enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And if you can, try and enjoy it.
Yeah.
I think most actually endure it rather than enjoy it. But the sense of pride, of course, when you get to the end is, well, that's indescribable. I think you've got to go through that to have that feeling. There's no words I can find that would actually convey exactly how proud you are when you get that Green Beret awarded to you.
Yeah.
That's the moment of your life.
Yeah.
And having had children and got married a couple of times and things like that, it's on that par. I wouldn't say it was greater. That's a bit unfair on my wife, because that probably was the best day of my life. Yeah. And then my children arrive, and that's another great day, isn't it? But it's up there. It's up there with that.
Yeah, and it's because you put so much mental energy and time into trying to pass this thing with people that you're so close to, and you're trying to help them pass it at the same time. So you're obviously going to feel a huge sense of pride for yourself and also for your country when you do pass it. Is there kind of a difference in between the way that you would train becoming a leader of your recruits? Because am I right in saying that you need to kind of distance yourself from your recruits a little bit when you are the leader?
Well, leadership training is an essential part of the military life. And again, it's not just the Royal Marines, the Army, of course, all the armed forces have the same principles. And there are specific courses for that. If you're an other rank, i.e. not commissioned, your first command course would be a junior command course to become a corporal, and then you do a senior command course to become a sergeant, and then there's an advanced command course to become a warrant officer, and so on. So each step requires a certain amount of training, and the attitude in the training and the requirement to work hard is very similar to recruit training. So the pressure never comes off. And that's one of the reasons why I don't use the word course in what I'm doing today with the guests on the Mountain Way experience. I call it an experience because the word course has all sorts of connotations. You have to pass in, you have to reach a certain standard to actually start the course. You can be failed. You're tested and evaluated all the way through. There's none of that in the program I run. Leadership from the officer's point of view, of course, is there from day one, and you're assessed on your potential before you're even accepted into the corps. There's a thing called an Admiralty Interview Board where you go down to Portsmouth and attend a 3-day program down there. But But I mean, the leadership is essentially what an officer's about. So you don't have to just learn the trade, of course, which encompasses everything to do with the military. That's why the officer training is a year long, or was anyway when I was there, as opposed to 6 months for a recruit. But you've also got to learn the leadership bit as well. And there's lots of opportunities through training, through the exercises where the command appointments are changed on a daily basis. Everybody gets a go at this. So, it's good training. And I think today, I'm not really au fait with what they're doing now, but I think the scientific approach to it has developed more than when I was there. When I was there, it was probably a bit more old-fashioned. But what it wasn't, it was about shouting at people and just issuing orders. And I remember very early being told, you cannot issue an order that's not workable. I want you to go and clean my car. Sorry, no, that's not part of your remit, and it's not part of his job, That is not a valid order. I mean, leadership rests on one thing. It's basically mutual respect. If the troops don't respect you, they won't follow you. They will follow you because of military law. They know that if they don't, things can happen. Yeah. But in the worst case, in war, and you're a bad leader, it can go very badly for the leader as well. There's plenty of examples of that happening. What I mean by that is getting shot by your own from behind, that sort of situation. Or in the good old days of the Royal Navy, quick lift over the side of the ship and you're gone. So leaders are very aware of the fact it's a very tenuous relationship and you've got to maintain it.
Yes.
And if you get a bit arrogant and a bit full of yourself and forget all that, it can bite you quite nastily. Yeah. So it's a good relationship. Yeah. It works.
And it's about mutual respect. I think
it's essential in battle. How do you get men to follow you? Yeah. Or to do what you want them to do? One of the section battle drills is trying to identify the enemy. If you couldn't identify the enemy, is to get somebody to stand up. Make yourself a target. I don't think I could actually give that order. But and I don't know if it's ever actually been done. But I remember when we were told that, I thought, blimey, this is the real world. Yeah. This is what it's actually about, So as a leader, how do you get somebody to do that?
And as a leader, did you kind of, knowing that, was there a kind of distance? I know that there's this mutual respect that has to be had, but let's say as a manager of a business, in a business, sometimes all the team members might go out for a drink and you might join them for one, but you'll never let them see you kind of drunk, so to speak, because you need to remain, you need to distance yourself a little, but still keep that respect. Is it the same type of deal when you're managing people? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we prefer to call it leading rather than managing, but yes. But you see, society changes and times change. Now I'm 70, I can actually look back, and it's a drop in time, isn't it? 70 years is nothing really, but in terms of a lifetime, it's a fair bit of experience, and it was still quite formal. I mean, many things have changed in the last 3 or 4 decades, I believe, in society generally. And it's been a big step change. We probably had a sort of set way of doing things for maybe 100, maybe 200 years, I don't know. Yeah. But I see a big significant change, probably caused by the end of the Second World War, probably, the 60s and hippie revolution and all that stuff. And political correctness coming in, that's a creeping cancer in my opinion, but that's made some big changes to things. A whole attitude to gender stuff and all that sort of thing, None of this was around in the time I joined up and for most of my service. In fact, when I saw this stuff starting to come in, it was one of the reasons why I left, because I realised this big change was coming. Yes. And it wasn't going to be the core I joined up to, and I'm not prepared to make these changes as well. So I think traditional leadership has always been the same way. And we were encouraged to do as much as we can to get alongside our Marines, to get to know them, but equally to let them know us. And the best way is to go for a drink. But there's a limit. Yes. Having said that, I can't say that I obviously followed that limit every single time. And some of my compatriots are famous for never following it. Yeah. And I'm not saying that was the right way to do things. And there are consequences, and sometimes you have to live with it.
Yeah. The hangover, I'm guessing, was
boys,
pretty bad.
No, I'm thinking worse things than hangovers, to be honest, much worse. But I don't think we can mention them here on the podcast. But no, I think leadership, it is difficult. It's a fine line to draw. And in fact, funny enough, with the guest I'm helping at the moment, he was talking about his commanding officer and his regimental sergeant major, both very well-known names in the Corps at the time, on Operation Herrick 14 with 4-5 Commando. He said it wasn't unusual to find the commanding officer in his grot having a drink with him. That to me was quite an eye-opener. Yeah. I couldn't imagine any of my commanding officers or regimental sergeant majors doing anything remotely like that. Now, it doesn't mean those people are wrong, not the slightest, because he had the highest regard for them. In fact, I know the reputation of those two particular people was as good as it can ever get. Yes. So a very effective leadership, but it kind of puts the junior officers in an awkward position because now you've got the top people doing this, the very thing we're told not to do. Where do we sit in all this? And I said, well, there's a bigger picture. As a whole, the command structure works very well, and you've got different personalities doing things differently. People have to adapt, and you learn how to cope with it.
Yeah.
But as a basic rule, yes, I mean, let people get to know who you are and be human, of course, and do lead by example.
Yes.
So if you say you can't do that, then it means you can't do it either. Simple stuff like that. But I don't think there's anything wrong in showing people your weakness occasionally. But to be an effective leader as well, you've got to be as good as them, if not better, at everything they do. And that was a basic principle. So, at the end of Royal Marine Commando training, the last test is the 30-miler, and recruits used to get 8 hours to do it in. That's with all the kit on, weapons a lot. Officers got 7 hours. So when you arrived in the unit, they knew you could do the 30-miler better than they could. Good principle.
Yeah.
I like that. That's the way to lead.
Yeah.
But it means you've got to put the effort in. You've got to work harder.
And it's leading by example. I think when I look at what's going on within businesses and the sort of higher CEOs and directors that I meet, when they established the business, as you said, had their finger in every pie, and they could do it to a certain degree to get the business buoyant. So when people come in, they employ people, they respect the CEO because they know that they've done their job and they've done it to a very, very good degree. So it's the same kind of thing. It's really just leading by example is how it should operate.
Simple principle.
We had a gentleman called Brian Wood on the podcast who fought in the Battle of Danny Boy. And one of the first things he said was, there was machine gun fire coming down on this armored vehicle, and the armored vehicle door kind of popped using a hydraulic system. And he was the first one to run out, leading by example so that his teammates would follow him, which I think is just such an incredible lesson for anyone, is do it yourself, and then people will follow you to do it. When did you first get deployed? Because I was reading that you were obviously deployed in Arctic, the Alps, Denmark, and then you were operational in Northern Ireland and Falklands?
That's right, yeah.
So how did you find the Arctic, the Alps and Denmark?
Loved it.
Yeah?
Fabulous. Yeah. Well, the Royal Marines are the country's mountain Arctic warfare experts. And within the Corps, 4-5 Commando has always prided itself on being the experts. That's a bit unfair on 4-2 Commando. But in my day, 4-5 always went well north the Arctic Circle, Narvik and beyond there. 4-2 Commando used to go to southern Norway, sort of on a parallel with Oslo,
Yes.
I mean, the snow's the same wherever you go, so it was a bit of didn't really make any difference. Yeah. But no, it's great training. I actually think the jungle is the finest environment to train soldiers in, but the Arctic comes a very close second because obviously it's cold and you have to learn how to survive in those conditions before you can actually fight in them. And all sorts of things change. I mean, one of the first things was a good Marine is always 5 minutes early, but in the Arctic, you're bang on time because you don't keep people waiting. So, for example, when the whole unit, let's say a troop, for example, is given an order to move, you have to work your time appreciation out. So when do you start bringing the tent down, that sort of thing? When do weapons have to be kept outside so they don't freeze by bringing them inside and so on. There's all sorts of ways of living in the Arctic, which, we've obviously discovered over the years. Which you have to adapt to. But the aim, of course, is everybody who puts a Bergen on gets into their skis and goes off at exactly the same time so that nobody's kept waiting.
Yes.
In sub-zero temperatures, you can't afford to do that.
Yeah.
No, it's a great environment. It really is. It's a beautiful country as well. I mean, it's fabulous, and it isn't just a skiing holiday.
It's stunning.
Actually, puster skiing is not skiing.
Yeah.
It's stumbling along with a pair of planks stuck to your feet. Falling over quite a lot as well.
I've been to Norway. I've shot in Norway and Finland for videography and photography, and it is undeniably beautiful.
Stunning, yeah.
Stunning. But it was interesting what you were saying. So when you take a gun into a tent and then out of the tent, because of the condensation, I'm guessing, on the gun, it will freeze up.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't work.
That's right. Yeah. You just have to adapt new drills, that's all.
Wow. I've never thought of that because I was thinking of when we were shooting the Northern Lights in Finland, our cameras had the same issue.
Yeah.
They would just freeze over.
Yeah.
And then I'm guessing everything would be stuck together so you couldn't really pull.
Well, it's just frozen, that's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But you see, you're a soldier, so you've got to be able to react at any moment.
Yes.
The enemy won't give you warning. You might say, oh, by the way, thaw your weapons out before I attack you if you don't mind, please.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that,
Yeah.
You may have to stand to like that.
Yeah.
Grab your weapon straight into your fire trench or whatever you got there, you've a position.
Yeah. And was there any other changes that you made? I know that you were saying you arrived on time when you leave the gun outside the tent so that it doesn't freeze up. Is there any other tweaks to your management of your recruits that you made while
Well,
you
these
were
are
there.
trained ranks. These weren't recruits. So we're now trained.
Right.
And now we're learning a specific skill to do with that training, just enhancing our capabilities.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, you just adapt to it. I mean, living in a snow hole, for example, that's a great experience.
Yeah.
I think it'd be quite comfortable, even though they're sort of -1 or 2 degrees, because it's relative to what, the outside ambient temperature is.
Yeah.
But it takes about 2 hours, maybe 2 to 3 hours to dig a snow hole. And you really are like a lemming. You burrow into this deep bank, and there's a certain way of doing it, and you learn what works and what doesn't work and so on. They're quite dangerous places, actually, because you can die of asphyxiation. You normally stick your ski pole up through the roof, so you've got a bit of ventilation, but if it snows, that can be covered. So you have to have a sentry that's going around the location all the time to make sure that people aren't actually being asphyxiated in their own snow holes.
Wow.
That sort of thing. It's just simple survival techniques. It's the same with the ice breaking drills when you ski deliberately into a lake.
Yes.
To get the feeling of what it's like. Because, I mean, after the ice bucket challenge and what's he called, Wim Hof, that sort of guy, and people like that, I think everybody's doing it now. So, I mean, it's no longer unique.
Yeah.
But like, you could say the Corps started this, like it did a lot of things.
Yeah.
We've been doing it for years.
Yeah. It shocks your system.
Everybody else has just discovered it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these are the skills you need to learn so you can survive in the environment before you can actually start applying the fighting element.
Do you think that, and we'll touch on this a bit later with Mountain Way and how you're kind of treating PTSD and helping these recruits or veterans rather. Do you think a lot of why you enjoyed the Marine Corps was because of the connection to nature? I mean, you talk about being in Norway, about about building snow caves to sleep in. Do you think a lot of it was about connecting to nature?
I'll cover that one first, but I'm sorry to say, I must correct you on one thing. We're not the Marine Corps. That's the USMC, the other crowd. We are
Royal Marines.
Royal Marines.
Yeah.
Remember that.
Yeah.
Right. The nature thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course it is. We love the outdoors, everything to do with it. And following on with the Mountain Way, that's exactly why I take people to the Pyrenees or to Ibiza in the winter for the same reasons.
Yes.
If you're going to, your job is outdoors. And, if you've lived in all environments, whether it's the Arctic, whether it's the jungle, whether it's the desert, whether it's temperate climate, they all require certain skills.
Yes.
But if you're not empathetic with nature, I mean, it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to adapt to it. So that's a natural selection part of it, or part of the selection that it automatically falls out of it. If you want to join the army, you want to be a soldier, you've got to be happy outdoors.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Amazing. And then, at what point did Northern Ireland and the Falkland Islands come into this?
Northern Ireland came in fairly soon after I joined 4-5, actually, back in the 70s, 77. That was Belfast. There was an emergency tour in 78. My third tour was 81, still in Belfast. That was my first tour as an officer, so I was now in charge of what's called a multiple. Then the next tour in 88 was in South Armagh. That was Crossmaglen. That was the most dangerous place in the world at that point. That was before Bosnia and all that started, and long before the most recent Middle East wars. And the last one was down in South Armagh as well. That was 94, 95, during the peace process, where fortunately there wasn't a lot going on. So that was Ireland. And the Falklands came in 82, and that just came out of the blue.
Yeah.
We'd been in the jungle training in Brunei for 3 months, and we were in Hong Kong on the way home when we heard the RGs had invaded, and everything changed completely overnight.
So did you just have to get flown out there straight away?
Yeah, the brigade and everybody had sort of already loaded ships in record time. I mean, the turnaround was phenomenal. We're talking days. And off they went. We flew back from Hong Kong to RAF Lucas up here. I don't remember how long we were at home, not very long. Handed in all the jungle kit, grabbed all the mountain Arctic warfare kit, said hello to the wife, said goodbye to the wife. And the little baby. And back on a plane. And we flew down to Sierra Leone, a refueling stop, and then on to Ascension Island, which was the sort of RV for everybody before we actually went down to deal with the problem. Because, of course, stuff was slung in so rapidly, it wasn't properly planned. It was impossible to do that.
Yes.
So it all had to be reorganized to make sure the stuff we need first is at the top and the stuff we need last is at the bottom, in the holds of ships, that sort of thing. So a lot of what's called cross-decking, a lot of helicopters of underslung loads and landing craft moving stuff around. And that took a couple of weeks at Ascension Island. But we were the first troops down there, apart from the advanced parties like the RAF and people like that setting up the airfield and so on. So we got there before the brigade turned up.
What was the actual problem with the Falkland Island? What was going on? Why was there so much unrest?
Well, the Argentinians claim it belongs to them.
Right.
Britain claimed it. I should know my history here. I couldn't tell you now. I think roughly about 200 years ago, in the 1800s or maybe the late 1700s, I think. I remember HMS Beagle was part of it, I think. So we had early explorers who'd found the place and set up sort of colonies, but they're very small and they didn't really amount to much. You could say, therefore, there is a legitimate claim. But because they're so close, only 300 miles off the coast of Argentina, the Argentinians, I suppose, assume it belongs to them. Well, the people that have grown up there and have developed their lives and are natural to the place and are proper islanders, they're British, and they are more British than we are. As I've found in any colony, you go to Gibraltar or Hong Kong or any of our other dependencies, the British connection is more important to those people than we believe it is. So you will find the Union flag everywhere, people standing up when the Queen's mentioned, all this kind of thing. So there's no doubt about their allegiance. And the Argentines just decided to invade. There are good reasons for why they did it, because the country was turning against what was called a junta. There were 3 people in charge. General Galtieri was the main man. There was a nasty, insidious little thing going on. They've got their own secret police, and about 2,000 Argentines, young men, had vanished, been chucked into the South Atlantic, murdered.
Wow.
This is a dictatorship, and unless you've lived in one, it's hard to imagine what that was really like. And the mothers had sort of coalesced into an organization, and very bravely, because they could have easily been just vanished, disappeared, were starting to parade and to make noise. And so the general feeling is that the junta decided, well, to deflect the national interest, attention on this problem, we'll go and invade the Malvinas, as they called it. So they did. And of course the country went mad, like they do, unfortunately, not thinking very far, and behind the whole thing before realizing what was actually going on and the implications. And our government at the time wasn't prepared to put up with that. So the reaction was very straightforward. We're going to get them back.
Yeah. Wow, I didn't know that. 200 people just vanished, boys.
No, 1,000.
2,000?
About 2,000, yeah. There's a lot of contention. Of course, as time goes on, people rewrite history, and the current crowd won't even admit to it. None of them admitted to it, but it was actually happening. One of the first people that surrendered to us was a guy called Lieutenant Commander Astiz. He was wanted by Amnesty International for war crimes. He was well known as a murderer. Their secret police and their intelligence people, the Nazis, same level, Stasi in East Germany, GDR, all these countries, North Korea, they've all got these mechanisms, these organizations, totally ruthless, no moral principles whatsoever.
My God. So to talk me through that, so you arrive on the Falkland Islands, and what's the first kind of things you do?
Well, D-Day is, have you ever seen D-Day or Saving Private Ryan?
Saving
right,
Private
it wasn't
Ryan.
quite like Saving Private Ryan, thank God.
Yeah.
Nothing's been like that.
Yeah.
But in our minds, it could have been. Fortunately, it wasn't. But it was a very tense day.
Yes.
It was the 21st of May. And we'd been at sea for, I don't know exactly, probably 3 weeks since we left Ascension Island. The moment we left Ascension Island and started heading south, we knew this is it. But we didn't know if we were going to go to war. We had no information whatsoever. I mean, today everybody's informed about everything. So, it's hard not to know anything. But back then it was the exact opposite. And I remember the night before we sailed being told, write your last letters now, because after tomorrow there's no chance and you won't be getting any mail. Wow. That was quite hard, writing a letter back to my wife thinking this might be the last letter. But everybody went through that. It was a normal thing.
Oh, my God.
So we didn't know, but one of the company commanders had a small transistor radio and he could pick up the BBC World Service. And that's where we got our information from. And that's when we heard that we'd sunk this cruiser called the General Belgrano. The Conqueror, HMS Conqueror, a sort of hunter-killer submarine, had sank her. Legitimately, and we declared a 200-mile exclusion zone around the islands. That was the first stage of establishing control of our islands.
Yes.
If you come inside that, you're legitimate targets. And it did. So they sank her. About 350-odd sailors died in that one. And as a result of that, I think 4 days later, they attacked HMS Sheffield with an X missile and destroyed her, and that killed 22 sailors, I think.
Jesus.
I think that was the number. So we knew from that point, right, the war's on. Up to then, there'd been a lot of diplomacy.
Yes.
There's a guy called Al Haig was shuttling backwards and forwards between Ronnie Reagan and Argentina and Maggie Thatcher, trying to sort it all out. He did a great job, but a complete waste of time, unfortunately. Just one of those things you have to go through,
Yeah.
The war was inevitable as far as Margaret Thatcher was concerned. There was no question of giving in to the Argies. So from that point onwards, and that was the 4th of May, I think the Sheffield was hit. We knew then. So the training changed, the tempo. It was already pretty strong, but now the motivation's really powerful.
Yeah.
And so on the 21st we landed. It went wrong, as they always do.
Yeah.
The plan was fine, nothing wrong with the plan. It was a workable plan, but it just didn't happen the way it was intended. So we actually went ashore in daylight when we should have been going ashore in the dark.
Jesus
That was quite nervous.
Yeah.
But nothing happened. We landed on the beach where we were expecting to meet a member of the SBS who was going to sort of guide us in. There wasn't anybody there. So we just stumbled off and followed the orders. And as we got off the landing craft, the first aircraft appeared. And bizarrely, it was red. This thing flew overhead so fast, nobody reacted. In fact, after it had gone, somebody shouted out, "Open fire," but it was a bit late.
Oh, wow.
And it turns out it was a training aircraft that we were 70 miles from where the main concentration was. We were on the west side of East Falkland. The bulk of the Argentine forces were on the other side, the capital called Stanley. Well, back in those days, it was called Port Stanley. They had roughly about 15,000 troops on the islands in total. We landed at about 5,000, so a ratio of about 3 to 1. And this thing had been sent up to report back on, there's a rumour something's happening. It was the beginning of them realising we've arrived. And that was the start of it.
So the plane flies over, they spot you.
Well, no, I think the pilot was looking at the ships in the Sound,
Right.
unaware of the thousands of troops underneath him. I mean, they're moving fast, right? So
Yeah.
there's a limit to what you can do.
Yeah.
But I think that's where his attention was, because that's where the threat to him was.
Yes, of
not
course.
from us.
Yeah.
The next time an aircraft turned up, every single weapon let rip. I mean,
wow.
It was mayhem. And that was it. We got over that initial sort of pregnant pause of what do we do sort of thing.
Yes.
That's the thing, the transition from peace to war, that's a critical thing. And the quicker you can get in that transition, the better your chances of survival are. Some people take a long time. So, you're still quite vulnerable until you've become that different person, which is not recognizable in civilian life.
Yes.
You're a soldier. You're now at war. So you have to leave the human bit behind, the family and all that stuff, doesn't belong.
And is that kind of transition in your brain when the war does start that sort of hardens you for the battle?
Well, it's experiences. I mean, shooting down aircraft was good fun. We're all cheering. It's just like being at the fair. Oh, I got another one. You don't think of the fact a pilot's just died right in front of you.
Yeah.
Although there's a little thought about that, but it's quite clear cut as the enemy. So there's no real compassion. I'm talking personally, of course. Everybody's different. I'm sure there will be people, particularly sailors who are not trained in the way we are, who would have felt that. But of course, they were the primary target. So I should think those sailors probably adapted very fast.
Yes.
Because the air attacks were coming in waves several times a day. But it's when you actually see something, and the first thing we saw was HMS Antelope blowing up, about D+3, I think. And that was right in front of us. That's a defining moment. And you see a capital ship break in half and sink. It took 12 hours to do that, but that's a shocking thing.
Jesus.
And then later on, when we got on the Yomp, we heard about 2 Paras attack at Goose Green, where Colonel Jones and 17 others had been killed. And that's now our business. Up until now, it's been the airmen and the sailors that have been fighting the war. We've just been bystanders in our defensive position, trenches on the hill, shooting at things, but mostly missing. Now it's our turn. And, you keep changing in degrees till all we want to do is kill the bastards. And that's all you've got in your mind. There's nothing else.
And how did that sort of feel to you, that transition from, shooting for, you're all having a kind of laugh when you're shooting at these planes to then, all right, we're taking the next step where 17 of our, brothers in arms have fought and passed?
How did it feel? I don't think you're aware of the change. I don't think I've been aware of any changes, frankly. It's only retrospectively you look back and you realise there's been a change, but you're not actually in the moment because you are in the moment. These things happen. I think the next big significant step for us was, I think it was the second day of the Yomp. I led the Yomp because of, being who I was with my achievements in training and all that stuff, being older, experience as a Marine. There were 9 rifle troops in 4-5 Commando. We were organised into 3 rifle companies, X-Ray, Zulu, X-Ray and Yankee. I was in Yankee Company. And we also had a support company, which had all the heavier weapons as well, and a headquarter company. So you got 5 companies in a commando, about 650 men. similar to an army battalion. And that was quite a challenge. I mean, it was a great honour to lead the unit. You know, you got 650, you can't get it wrong. So your navigation has to be good. But it was bloody hard ground, awful stuff. And we were carrying ridiculous weights, over 100 pounds, 120, 150 in some cases. I mean, staggering along with that kind of stuff on the back over this awful... And, of course, the weather was, just horrible. Although weather isn't really an issue, you know, because you're so used to it through training. I won't say you're not aware of it, but it's not really a major factor.
And we're numb to it.
You get wet, you get cold. Been there before. You even get hungry because we weren't fed for 3 days. That yomp took 5 days. And I think it was on the second night, we'd attacked a position, but when we got there, the enemy had legged it, so we never actually saw them. And we'd crossed a river to attack it, and we'd left all our kit behind because we went into attack mode, if you like. And so we spent a night without it, soaking wet. That was a hell of a night, one of the worst I've ever had, I think. And that was the night we heard about Two Paras battle at Goose Green. And we also heard that the BBC had announced it on the World Service. And that was something else, because now we're being betrayed by our own people. And when we heard this as officers at the Company O group, we had a debate about whether we should tell the men or not, because this is going to have a serious effect on morale.
Yes.
It was pointless, they already knew. A buzz like that gets out.
Yeah.
And everybody knew. And that was the first time I saw palpable anger. And we had 2 journalists embedded in the unit, and they went very quiet and disappeared, quite rightly so. They were good blokes. There was nothing wrong with them. They were doing a good job. But, you suddenly realise you're on your own. All you've got is your mates. And that you can't even rely on your own government because they weren't controlling it properly. Things like that, So these stages is where you change from, I'm never carrying the mementos. I've never taken pictures of my wife. You see it in these American films, some pilot sticks a picture of his daughter on, for goodness sake, you're at war, mate. What do you want to do that for, And I couldn't do that when I went home. My wife didn't want the Bergen and my boots and kit in the house. She was quite right. I don't want the war stuff in the house. And I had to make that mental change as well to fit in, which prior to the Falklands with Northern Ireland wasn't too difficult. After the Falklands, it was impossible. I couldn't prevent it. And that's where the beginning of the split started, I suppose.
Yeah.
So you've got to keep the two separate, So there's nothing to do with the family at all or that life. Yeah. You're purely focused on what you're doing, which is the only way to survive and win.
Yeah.
Because if you don't give it everything, you won't.
Take me back to kind of like an active war zone within the Falklands. You described being shot at by a plane.
Well, I think we were all shot at by planes at one point or another. Not directly me personally, and I don't think the pilot sort of, look, there's Shaw, I'll have a go at him.
Yeah, yeah.
But, there was stuff, yeah, definitely.
Jesus, so what was that like? You've got a plane flying overhead, you see bullets.
Well, nothing actually came near me personally, trench-wise. But I think Marine Andrews, was killed in 40 Commando. And I saw a name at the memorial 2 days ago. And I think he was a Sikh, and I can't remember his name now. And I think he was killed in an air attack at what was called Blue Beach. We were in a place called San Carlos Water, which became known as Bomb Alley. And the whole of the brigade, that was 3 commando units and 2 parachute battalions, were deployed around this large fjord, if you call it. The fjord was probably 10 miles deep. And of course, we were inside the hills, which gave the ships some protection, and they had rapier batteries on the hills. But the rapiers didn't work properly because they'd been in the bottom of ships, and it had screwed them up. All the movement at sea had damaged. They got their act together eventually, but it took a few days. Now I do remember a Mirage coming up straight up the hill over us, and we all sort of let rip at it. But the guy that hit it had a general purpose machine gun. He was actually guarding the rapier battery on the hill behind us. And the poor old radio operator came out and just threw his helmet on the ground in disgust because the missile refused to engage. But the man with the GPMG got it, and that went down. It was exciting stuff. It was boys' own stuff, really, to be honest, when you look at it. And I may sound horribly callous to young people today, particularly, but maybe that's the change in society. Maybe that's what's changed when you think of the upbringings we had. The rough and tumble in the playground, the bullying element, and fighting that's going on quite regularly and all sort of stuff. A lot of that's been removed from life today, which is, I suppose, a good thing. But our preparation for war was probably more beneficial. We weren't strangers to violence. This is just a more refined form, and it's probably the ultimate form of violence. It's on a bigger scale, isn't it? To say it's not exciting is a lie. It was exciting until it became personal. Then it changes.
At what point did it become personal?
Well, as I've described, when we heard about the 2 Paras attack at Goose Green, when we heard about the BBC's betrayal, things of this nature, that's personal.
Yeah. And there's a pivotal moment for you within the Falklands Islands that kind of paved the way for what was to come with Mountain Way and helping people with PTSD. A kind of blue on blue action.
Oh yeah. Yeah, well, that was the ultimate thing. Well, there were two elements. There was that, and then there was the actual battle that the unit took part in, which our battle. When we finished the Yomp, which I think took 7 days, but we spent 2 days at Teal Inlet for some reason. We got into the mountains. Port Stanley's surrounded by a couple of concentric rings of mountains. Mm-hmm. Now, they call them mountains is a bit misleading because they're not real mountains, not in even the British context. You got Ben Nevis just up the road here, 4,000 feet.
Yeah.
I couldn't honestly tell you what it was. Mount Kent was about 1,000 foot above sea level. So it's a hill, really, to be precise.
Yes.
But they are basically high ground, and that's significant to a soldier because it means you've got to go uphill. If the enemy's sitting on top, they have the advantage, all that kind of thing. When we got to as far as we could go without coming into contact, i.e. safely, but we're close enough now to actually engage the enemy. Mm-hmm. So you want what's called the reverse slope, i.e. the backside of a mountain where they can't see you.
Okay.
But if they could see you, they could drop stuff onto you, and they did try. I was told by the commanding officer, you're going forward. I want you in no man's land, and I want you to operate against the position. But first of all, I want to find out what's on the ground. So my troop was sent forward about 4 kilometres ahead of the unit, and now actually in sight of the enemy. And that was a very challenging position to be in because there was no cover. So there was no movement in the daytime. It was all at dark at night time. And we had 16 hours of darkness then. It was the austral winter coming into it. And that's where we did all our work. And so to start with, it was just get familiar with the ground and find out what the enemy has actually got there, and how do we get across this river, for example. There was a river Murrell that ran straight through our TAOR, Tactical Area of Responsibility, our bit of ground. Mm-hmm. 3 para were on the left flank, 4-2 Commando were on the right flank, but 4-2 was a long way to the south. They were attacking a hill called Mount Challenger. Our feature was called Two Sisters because there's 2 prominent features. And on the left flank, 3 para was going to attack Mount Longdon, which was a smaller feature, but a longer one. So that's what we were lined up to do. And that was the brigade in place to attack. 2 para had already had their battle at Goose Green back on the west side, and they were now moving along the southern flank. And by this time, 5 infantry brigade had arrived to beef up the numbers, and there was the Scots Guards, the Welsh Guards, and the Gurkhas. So you got 3 more, if you like, fighting units on the southern flank. I won't get into too much of the politics because it's too complicated for a podcast, but that's essentially what it was. There was a tragedy at Bluff Cove when the 2 landing ships, Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram, were attacked by air attack, and the Welsh Guards suffered very badly there, about 50 dead, I think, roughly. And one of those that was on the ship was my first radio operator. And on the Yomp, as we were moving along, his ankles suddenly gave way, he tore the tendons, he just fell over. We had to leave him. And he ended up on the Sir Galahad 30 minutes before the bombs came through. He didn't get a scratch, but he described what he'd seen there, horror signs, people shooting each other and all that sort of stuff, people on fire. And that causes PTSD, which eventually led to his cancer, which killed him 2 Christmases ago. So that delay meant that the brigade didn't attack the mountains as intended. There was a pregnant pause, which gave me more time to operate. So we'd pretty much done everything. We'd found out where their minefields were. Well, actually, we found where they weren't, rather than where they were. We had some idea about their weapons because they'd been dropping artillery fire, but prophylactic stuff. They didn't know we were there, just assuming somebody was there and chucking it out anywhere. Yeah. Same with .5 machine guns. You suddenly see a line of tracer arcing through the night. Wasn't directed at anything particular. It was more a sign of nerves, actually. But my mission was to cause casualties and harass the enemy, and the way we did that was we had a mortar fire controller attached to it. Sorry, an artillery forward observation officer. Get that right. Bombardier Nozzer Holt, great guy from 2-9 Commando. 2-9 Commando Royal Artillery were our artillery. They were equipped with the 105 light gun, which can fire a round out to 17,000 metres. And we were directing that fire onto the position in the daytime. So we were crawling up into a position where we could observe and just bringing down fire on them. And it was it was an interesting experience because you rarely get a chance to do all that. So Nother dropped the first fire mission, and being an expert, it was pretty much where we wanted it to be. Sometimes you've got to adjust the fire, it's not exactly where you want it. What was strange about it was that they never seemed to learn. We'd see a queue of people on the saddle skyline 4 kilometres away, and you'd see the rounds land and the queues vanished. And then people would walk up to look at, presumably going to see if they could offer help, I imagine, and we'd just repeat fire. And that happened day after day after day. So we got the impression they were changing troops over every night, but they weren't handing over. They weren't warning them of the danger.
Yeah.
Their field kitchen was actually in the middle of the saddle. So unlike us, who've got individual ration packs, 24-hour ration packs, they had central feeding. So we came across sacks of onions and loads of tins of RG beef and rubbish, The RG officers had ration packs with cigarettes and whiskey and all the Gucci gear, but the lads didn't get that. We're back to leadership again. Every British officer eats exactly what everybody else eats. So that's how we caused the casualties for about a week. But then in the end, they said, no, you've got to stop that now because we're running out of ammunition. We need to conserve it for the actual battles that are coming up. So then the mission changed from that to, right, you've got a fighting mission coming up now, and you've got to get onto that position, find their mortar positions and destroy them. And that was the mission that led to the Blue on Blue. So without taking too long over it, because I know the time factor here, I could talk all day about this one. It was a troop operation. With the recce patrols, there was smaller groups going out, taking out sort of 4 or 6 men, that sort of thing, But this now was everybody. And it's a change of mentality. In a recce patrol, you obviously don't want to be seen. You're very quiet, it's very slow, it can be very cold. It can be quite frightening, especially when you get close to the enemy and you think you might get pinged, you might have to fight your way out, that sort of thing. But with a fighting patrol, there's no pretense. You're not trying to hide now. You're just going to get in there. You're a big bully. Go and destroy everything you can.
Yeah.
We were going so far that we were going beyond the range of our own mortar support. So a section of our mortar troop was detached to support us. Now, the coordination of all this is where I think the initial problem began. And I'm not going to point any fingers here, but sometimes these operations are beyond the individual. It's a collective effort. Other people are involved as well. And all that happened was that in the early stages of the patrol, we'd been warned just before we left that the RGs had special forces, I think called 601 Commando, operating in the area. There was a good chance we were going to meet them. I sometimes wonder how these things happened. It's looking back now, you can see the pieces of the jigsaw coming together to create something that you can't possibly anticipate. And that's one of those things that's still a question in my mind, because they never materialised. They did exist, but they weren't there. But in the dark, when my lead scout spotted something, we automatically assumed it was these people.
Yeah.
And then we went through the process of clearing it with everybody else, particularly this mortar section. Are you ready to support us? We're going to need you. Unfortunately, they didn't tell us the truth. If they said no, we're moving and we're in this area, that would have been a different matter. Unfortunately, we were told, yes, we can support you. We confirmed it with our neighbour, 3 Para. Had they got any patrols on the ground? No, they hadn't. This all took time, of course. But it all happened in the space of a few seconds, because this group that was just about visible in the dark was only a couple hundred metres away. And suddenly they were moving, and we were in a position now, you've got to do something immediately. So it became a hasty ambush. So I initiated the ambush. There were 21 of them. We hit 7 out of 21. 3 of them survived. The other 4 didn't. And that was the turnaround point in my life. That was the moment when everything changed. I see life as being before crisis, sort of BC, and after damage, AD, and I can pinpoint it to an exact moment and an exact place, which probably is quite rare, I suppose. But that's how I see things now, and everything changed as a result of that. That took all night to deal with that. There was a debrief which lasted 15 minutes with the CO in the morning, and then it's right, get back to your troop. The brigade attacks in tonight. So that night we were straight into the Battle of Two Sisters. That lasted for 16 hours. In the initial stages, the other 2 troop commanders in my company were both injured, one by a mortar round that killed the guy next to him, one by a .5 that killed the guy next to him. We were all in the same area. We were just so lucky. My troop was mega lucky. All the troops and companies I've commanded never had a single injury. So when we actually got up onto the feature, of course, another company was actually conducting the initial stage of the battle to actually get onto the feature to fight our way up there.
what was going to be a company attack suddenly became a 5-troop attack. That was my troop, the other 2 troop commanders. We thought they were dead. They weren't. They survived. That lasted till the end of the battle. I think that was the 12th of June. We then, on the 13th, that's right, the Scots Guards attacked Tumbledown and the Gurkhas attacked Mount William. Those are the next features. And then on the 14th, we went into attack Sapper Hill, which was the feature directly behind Port Stanley, the last feature. It was more of a common, it wasn't a hill. It was just a bit of high ground.
Was that more defended because it was the last kind of...
No, it wasn't. I mean, we were on the way and it was frightening because we had no intelligence, no previous recce. We were doing it in daylight. We're going through a minefield. How much worse can it get?
Yeah.
And completely exposed, no cover whatsoever. So any moment now, the artillery is going to start landing. We're going to start taking casualties. I mean, it was a desperate act.
Yeah.
But it was on that move in that we heard that the white flag had been seen over Stanley. And suddenly it had all collapsed.
Yes.
The war was over. What a feeling that was. So that was the 14th of June, the day the RG surrendered.
Yeah.
And that was the end of the war, basically.
Wow. And in terms of post-war, was there any kind of... therapy is a relatively new thing, but was there any kind of counselling at all, talking to you?
Good old-fashioned counselling. Oh, you get pissed. And that's what we did. We got on the ship, the Stromness. We sailed back to Ascension Island. I think we were at sea about 2 weeks. And I think that was a significant period. Yeah. Only yesterday, in fact, last night, I was talking to this guest I've been helping, in Jock's house. We were just doing an informal chat. And we were talking about this decompression element, which is a new thing. You're quite right. We didn't have anything formal back then. There was no therapy of any sort. And he said, yeah, I went to Cyprus and they took our kit off us so we could be washed, and we were just in our sort of, shorts and T-shirt. We were taken down to the beach. There were all these sort of big blow-up toys in the water, and there was alcohol. And that was it. 24 hours of that, and then back on the plane and home. And I thought, well, what kind of therapy is that? If I'd just come out of 6 months fighting the Taliban, and while we're on that subject, I just want to make this point. I've done some serious thinking about this. I'm quite right in thinking what I'm saying. We have never seen such sustained war fighting ever in the history of the British Isles. If you go back in time, we had campaigns like the Napoleonic Wars, Wellington and the Peninsula, this sort of stuff. People were away from home for years. Of course they were. The Navy used to blockade ports for years, Brest and Toulon and so on. But they weren't actually in battle all that length of time. First World War, battalions were rotated through the lines. Yes, over 4 years. Some were at war for 4 years, but they weren't actually in contact. In the Second World War, the Americans had a 30-day rule. Our own Bomber Command had a 30-mission rule. After that, you're out. We had people in FOBs, forward operating bases, in Helmand for 6 months, going out every day on patrol with tourniquets on every limb, knowing that somebody is going to step on an IED every single day. We've never had that before. So that's why I know the PTSD issue, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. I think much worse is to come. But anyway, sorry, got off track there, but I thought it was important to make that point.
No, absolutely. And I think it definitely is. I think that it's definitely getting better now, but I do believe that the help available isn't enough, especially when someone's been through something so
nowhere near enough.
Traumatic.
It's completely inadequate.
I mean, we were talking about this before, you go to therapy once a week. That's not going to change the way that your brain is wired. If you want to build a habit, you need to do it every single day.
Yeah.
It's like going to the gym. You can't go once a month and build muscle. Yeah. Or once a week and build muscle. You need to probably go 6 times a week, 7 times a week. Talk to me about what PTS was for you, or PTSD was for you. How did that kind of come to fruition?
Well, I can again only say retrospectively, and after a lot of thinking about it, we're talking years of thinking. I think I can be accurate, but at the time, of course, totally unaware. On the ship coming back, I started developing a sort of form of paranoia. I started thinking people were talking about me behind my back. I remember feeling that, and of course, the feeling of shame was overwhelming. Failure. We just killed 4 of our own people. And when I say we, that's unfair because the troop didn't. The troop obeyed orders. I did that. But I was also in part of us. It was patently obvious to everybody that we weren't actually at fault. That unfortunately the people we killed should have been more honest. And if their behaviour had been as it should be by the book, it might have been a different outcome. But, that's a bit unfair to say that because they're not here to defend themselves. So you can't say that. So it's one of those things that festers in the imagination. So this was a natural process, I think. We were all suffering with a form of delayed shock. We'd only just come through the battle where we lost another 4 guys. We lost 13 in total. 255 actually servicemen killed in that very brief war. That only lasted for a couple of months. When I got home, telling my wife about it, she had no idea how to deal with this. This came as a major shock out of the blue. She was from Singapore, so she's got a cultural difference as well. And also, although she'd been in the UK since she was a little girl, I think her great fear was going into a supermarket and people pointing at her and saying, he's married to that guy that killed your husband, sort of thing, because it's a small community. And these things, there had been white feathers issued to men on rear party, men who had stayed in camp to guard it while the rest of us went south and had the fun. These guys would have done anything to swap with us. Actually got white feathers given to them, the old symbol of cowardice. Things like this, it's human nature. So there was a real fear there. When I went down to Oakhampton to tell my parents, same reaction. They had no idea. This wasn't promulgated anywhere. So my mum said, well, okay, thank you for that. Let's go down the pub. So we walked down the pub, a little village called Folligate, just outside Oakhampton. And, the bunting was up, and I wasn't known. I wasn't local hero or anything like that. Nobody knew me, but they knew of me. And I walked into the pub, and there was overwhelming reception, which is the very last thing I wanted. If that ship could have gone round in circles for several months in the South Atlantic, I'd have been quite happy. But unfortunately, we had to go home. I've just realised there was something before that when we arrived. Our first reunion in Condor Barracks, having flown back into Lucas, coaches through Angus and Fife. People were up at 3 a.m. I mean, it was July. It's midsummer. It's daylight. There were people on the streets that time in the morning with banners and things. It was a fabulous welcome, wonderful. And we got back to the camp, and all the families were there, thousands of people. But it felt really strange to meet my wife. I couldn't really describe it. It was the beginning of a problem, really, I suppose. I don't think I was alone in this, but probably mine was magnified. So we're in this pub down in near Oakhampton, and a bloke walked up to me at a pint. I was sat down, just trying to absorb it all and not really knowing what to do. And he put this pint down in front of me and sort of wanted to shake my hand and, well done and all this sort of stuff. And then he looked at me straight in the eye and he said, tell me, what's it like to kill somebody? And I just got up and walked out. There was no other reaction. And talking to my guest last night about this, and he'd had a similar experience, he said, I wanted to just drop him. I said, no, that's funny, I didn't feel that. I mean, that would be the logical conclusion, and if it was to happen today, it might be the way I'd react. But I think the denial phase, it was like a shutter had come down in my mind.
Yeah.
There was a clear break between what the eyes were doing at the front and what was going on at the back. There was a disconnect, which was now affecting my relationships as well. So I couldn't react. And yet there were strange reactions. One thing I couldn't cope with was my daughters crying. Emma was just coming up to 2. In fact, Lisa wasn't born at this point, but later she came on the following year. And little girls, like little boys, they cry from time to time. It's quite natural. Well, to me, it was the same sound of the men that we killed in the battle. That's how men sound when they're dying, crying for their mothers and things like that. I had to leave the house every time. Every time. And my wife couldn't understand it, and I couldn't explain it. So she thought, you callous bastard, kids need help. But I just physically couldn't do it. So these were the sort of things that were starting to happen in the early stages. I don't think the denial phase actually ended, but then I slipped into some other role where it got quite dark, actually. And I think it was aligned to the fact that I was now becoming a bit of a legend. And this is a strange thing because you would have thought, the shame around a blue on blue is not something to create a legend out of. Certainly nobody spoke about it, neither did I. It was never mentioned by anybody, ever at all. We just cracked on with life. I'd changed jobs now, I'd left there. I tried to get into special forces. I spent about a year banging my head against the wall before it became obvious they weren't going to take me on. I tried all of them. SBS, SAS, 14 intelligence, MI6, the lot. Nobody wanted me. So I think that was an attempt to prove to myself that I was a professional soldier. I was, but I had a need to prove it because of this apparent failure. I went over the events that night so many times, literally thousands, I should think, over the years. You know, it's 42 years ago or something like that. And the conclusions were always the same. So, you know, it was repetitive nonsense, really. But nonetheless, there was still this drive to prove something, I suppose, to myself and maybe to others as well. And that's where this legend began. And people used to actively talk about it, you know. Well, I went on a staff course, and the major running it at Warminster, he'd been in Germany all his life, and so I don't think he'd ever seen contact of any sort. And he'd say, well, that's what the book says, but now, Andy, you're the expert. How do you think it really happens? And I used to get asked this all the time. I said, well, I haven't a bloody clue. I don't know anything about tank warfare, you know.
Yeah.
You know, I know that's what we're talking about, but you know, there was an automatic sort of you're the expert sort of thing. So it developed from there. And then I got into a very dark phase where I started killing rabbits. And this took me a long time to understand this. There was no need to. I didn't need them for food, and, you know, I don't see them as pests per se. But I think it was an obsession. And I look back now and I realize what it was. It was another form of self-harming. It was to make myself feel bad about myself. Because there was no conclusion, there was no outcome of this. I mean, I don't think anybody justified legal action and going to prison, for example, or something of that nature. These accidents happen in every conflict, you know, and they're not deliberate. They're always as a result of a chain of events which are beyond anybody's control. It just happens, unfortunately. If you think about the forces involved and the fact that you've got massive hatred, two forces coming together, this is inevitable. These things are going to happen regardless. But that's not acceptable to the rational, sensible human I am. I'm a balanced person brought up by good parents. I know the difference between right and wrong and all the rest of it. So there has to be some atoning. So I think that's what was behind all this. I hated myself for what I was doing. And it was a perpetuation of that. And that sort of had to work its way out. That took quite a while, I suppose. And then I think by this time now, I was properly deep in the PTSD problem. Going shopping, I would, driving to the supermarket, I'd go round the roundabout twice. And my wife would look at me and think, what are we doing? We're supposed to be going to Tesco's. I couldn't tell her I was checking the VRNs, the vehicle registration numbers of the cars following us, to see if somebody's following. I'd look in the windows, you know, you'd stop at a window and stare in the window, and she'd be looking at me strangely because it's an Ann Summers shop. And I'm not looking at the dolly bird in the G1098 webbing. I'm looking at the reflection in the glass of who's behind. And you can't explain any of that stuff. You know, this is proper paranoia. You can see a firing point somewhere. You see a car that looks a bit strange. It could be an IED, and this is the Northern Ireland stuff. So the crossover between these two, the results of the Falklands and the PTSD was now feeding off the Northern Ireland stuff as well. So I never had any PTSD problems with Northern Ireland, not at that point. But afterwards, it had a big impact, especially the 88 tour in Crossmaglen, where I came right to the edge. So it was all building up, you know, and you can imagine what effect that's having on my wife, of course. So there was nothing good in this relationship from her point of view. It was just going badly wrong. And the fact she struggled on so long, actually, full credit to her. You know, she did try to keep it going. And I think the final phase, if you like, was caused by attempted suicide. And that was the day after my 35th birthday, which was the 31st of March 1989. And it was the third weekend I was working for the army in Brecon, and my house was in Exmouth. My wife had refused to move up to a married quarter, so we're now separated for the week, and I'm going home at the weekends. And she'd reached the end of her tether, and it was all horrible. Everything went pear-shaped. And I had to go. But fortunately, it didn't happen. And that was a big turnaround point. And I think from that point onwards, the sort of realization of what really matters in life and the acceptance that there is something wrong. Because prior to that, I was just going through, I was just experiencing, you know, I wasn't really analysing. In fact, there was no analysing at all until I'd broken away completely many years later. But that was, I think, a turnaround point. And those are the two lowest points of my life. Not the day my mum died or my dad died or any other relatives I care about. Those are natural parts of life. Very sad, grieving and all that stuff, you know. But the night of the blue on blue and the night of the attempted suicide were the deepest points. That's as close as you can get to the edge, I think. And one of those consequential revelations is, well, it can't get any worse. There's only one way to go now. When you're at the bottom, go back up again.
And maybe I can thank my parents genetically, and I can thank the boarding schools, and I can thank all those things in life, which might seem like negatives back then, but they're not. They're powerful things that have enabled me to survive, and then to go on from that to thrive, which is where I am now. So, so I think those are the major phases of the whole PTSD thing. But I didn't actually know anything about it until 2008.
How did you discover?
Well, as I mentioned earlier on, I'd run up this big debt living on the boat and not having any income.
Yeah.
So I got a job in maritime security. It was a very low-grade thing. I was sat on a barge in the South China Sea. Once I'd cleared the debt and had some money, I bought a computer. But typical of me, I bought it in Malaya, so I had to learn Malay before I could switch the bloody computer on. So it took a while, but I was there for 5 months doing pretty much nothing on my own, so it wasn't onerous. And then I found this thing called Googling, and I started doing that. And I don't honestly remember exactly how it started, but I think I must have put some words in, these various conditions. The guilt was the biggest one, of course. And suddenly up came this stuff to do with the NHS, and I saw this phrase, post-traumatic stress disorder, and I started reading that and thought, blimey, that's me. Now, this is obviously self-diagnosis, which any doctor will tell you is wrong, and fair enough, I'm not arguing with that. But the shame element prevented me from ever talking about it in the military, and this is one of the big problems everybody has. You're a man, you don't cry, you don't do this, you don't do that sort of stuff, you just put up with it. As daft as it sounds now, but that's the way it was. So I think, but it was a revelatory moment. It was like, yeah, God, bloody hell. This is what I've been living with for 28 years, I think, at that point, maybe more. Can't remember exactly. But it'd been preceded by a lot of time sitting on a beach in Formentera, stark naked, doing nothing but writing words in the sand like guilt and shame and horror. And I hadn't heard of hypervigilance at that point, but that's what I was. And I include hypersensitivity in there. I'm very sensitive to things, oversensitive. You put Bambi on, I'll be streaming in tears. Put on certain music, I can't stop the tears. It just happens. Yeah. I accept it. It's just part of who I am now. But the learning curve was pretty steep. But that was another big moment when I thought, that was 2008. So from that point on, things started to make sense and led inevitably to where I am now.
And how did Mountain Way come into this? I mean, it's talk about having an incredible purpose in life. You're trying to help people through the same experiences that you had. I mean, that's really amazing. So talk to me about Mountain Way and how this came into it and how you help these veterans that perhaps have this disorder.
Well, it's another long, shaggy dog story, I'm afraid, but I'll keep it as brief as I can. We lived on the boat for 18 years, and, when our son got to the age of 4, we decided he had to go into school. Actually, be more honest, my wife decided. She made all the right decisions.
The boss.
Well, I used to say to people, and there's 2 on the boat, they were interested about who's actually the captain here. And I said, look, I'm the captain, but she's the admiral. No, it was a great thing. A boat will either make or break a relationship. And so if your relationship's good, it's absolutely solid, And we're just 2 halves of the same whole, really. So this decision was made, and so we stopped sailing around because obviously Tom had to go to school every day, and so that was the beginning of the change, I suppose, from the free life, which was lovely, but had its downside as well, like bad weather, for example. So that was 2004. So I started thinking in terms, right, what are you going to do? Your life just can't go on like this indefinitely. I'm not going to become the useless bum, because we were surrounded by a lot of them. This is in a place called San Antonio, which has a reputation which is very unfair, to be honest. It was the only free port in the Western Mediterranean, so I dropped my own mooring there and never paid anybody a penny. Sat there for 5 years, I think.
Get a tan.
I'd already had that, yeah. But basically, trying to think what to do. And so the anti-piracy thing suddenly popped up. And of course, I had no knowledge of anything in the world. My entire knowledge was about 6 miles in diameter. You can see roughly 3 miles at sea level. And so that was my life. Anything outside of that, no news, no mobile phone. I haven't bought a paper for decades, nothing at all. It was beautiful, it really was. And I do think it was significant in the recovery stage. It was important.
Processing time.
Yeah, but that's right, given the time to process as well, but also just not being affected by negativity, because, my whole lifestyle has changed. It's geared towards reduction of stress in whatever form it comes. And the media's nothing but stress. So I think, and I got into maritime security, and this eventually led to me, after a year in Singapore trying to get a partnership off the ground, which didn't work,
setting up my own company. And unfortunately, after a year, the investor that was going to bring in the money failed, and so that collapsed as well. But this all happened at the same time as other things were happening as well. And those other things, which are more relevant to what we're talking about, the first one was the reunion of 4-5. And I think it was at the 20-year point, I think. And that was a really emotional experience for me. I was so affected deeply by it that I missed not one, but 2 flights from here back to Ibiza. And my dear friend Paul, who was one of those guys injured in the Battle of Two Sisters, who was now the commanding officer at Faslane, he bought me the flight, and he got his PA to actually take me by the hand and put me on the plane. That's how bad it was. And it was only 2 days in Condor Barracks, but, there was a lot of hugging, a lot of tears. And my poor radio operator, who, as I described earlier on, has now succumbed. He was one of those. So, yeah, it was something I tried to shy away from because I just didn't feel like I could face it. Anyway, that was a breaking the ice sort of thing. 5 years later, we have another one. That was equally emotional. But this is starting to lead towards the time now where I'm trying to get the maritime security off the ground, and so I'm struggling with all that, but it's not happening. And then in 2012, I went back in June for the reunion, and it was the best one ever. It was a big turnout, over 500 turned up. Really good. Organised by our former Sergeant Major, W2 George Meakin. If anybody knows 4-5 at that time, they'll know who I'm talking about. A genuine legend. And the commanding officer of the unit at the time in place was a man I'd trained in the 90s, Colonel Mike Tanner, who's an absolute monster of a bloke. I mean, he wouldn't get through this door, he's huge. He's not natural, but a lovely bloke. And he said to me, would you be prepared to come back and talk to my unit? I said, yeah, I'd love to, Mike. What do you want me to talk about? He said, well, your war and, the consequences. Yeah, well, you know the story, mate. If you think that's the right thing, I'll come and do it. So on the 6th of September, 2012, I stood up in front of 4-5 Commando in the morning, the bulk of the unit, and I gave this presentation. And I almost cracked the 500-slide barrier on PowerPoint. I got to 490-something. Death by PowerPoint. But no, they were on the edge of the seats because it was all relevant stuff, and all the photographs were all carefully selected and all that sort of stuff. That had a major impact on the unit. There was 2 lengthy 10-minute standing ovations. The CEO got up to say, well, thank you very much. And before he could finish his speech, they were all clapping. There was about, 400 people in there. Anyway, that was the beginning. Then we retired to the Sergeants and Warrant Officers Mess, and I did the same thing there. And there was an absolute silence. And only later, retrospectively, did I understand the significance of that I was actually touching some raw nerves here. They'd just come back from Afghanistan. And then that night, I did it again in the officers' mess. It was a long day, Thursday the 6th of September, I'll never forget it. And I finished that one about midnight. It was a regimental dinner, actually. It was done really nicely. We retired to the bar, and there was a line of pints waiting for me. Oh, sorry, lads, I don't do that anymore. Thank you, I appreciate it. Then I realised what it was. And the guy coming, Andy, can I have a quick word? Yeah. Off into the corner of the mess, sit down in a quiet place, and he started talking. And then I started to realise what he was talking about. Because he'd heard and I'd talked about my experiences, it was opening it up for him.
Yeah.
And that went on for the rest of the night. At breakfast, I managed to get as far as the settee in the foyer. Almost got out of the mess. Didn't quite make it. I was still sat listening to some guy talking about his problems.
Yeah.
So I said to Mike, Mike, I think you've got a few problems here. He said, yeah, I know. I said, I think your adjutant's pretty poor. He said, yeah, definitely. And that was the beginning of understanding that there might be something I can do to help here. And then on the following day, the Friday, I went down to the Legion just to say goodbye to the lads, have a couple of pints. I call them the old and bold, forgetting I'm actually one of them. I still can't compute the fact I'm old. And I got in the taxi to come back to Condor, and the driver said to me, are you the chap that's been talking about the Falklands? Obviously the word had got out. I said, yeah, I think so. He said, well, I was on HMS Sheffield. And that was it. So we drove back to camp, took about 10 minutes, crossed the camp to the mess, parked up, and he just carried on talking. And I said, sorry, I've got to stop you. I said, is that meter still running? He went, I'll forget that. He switched that off completely.
Yeah.
I said, 2 hours, sat in the car, and he talked about it. He said, I've never spoken to anybody about it. 30 years after the event, this is the first time I've talked about it. I didn't do any talking, I just listened, And that was when I realised, you've got to do something about this. So that was the turnaround point. And that, a bit like the night of the blue on blue, here's another moment in time and place I can put a finger on it and say, that's where my life changed again.
Yep.
So the maritime security wasn't going anywhere. The wave, forgive the pun, had gone through. We're on the backside of that sort of stuff now, and it was pointless. So I closed that all down, And I started focusing on this and began putting it together. That was the end of 2012. 2013 was a non-year for me. My father-in-law died on the 25th of May. I'd just come back from a 3-month recce of this country. The last bit of money I hired a car. My daughter was still living in the UK then. She's in Dubai now with her family. And I drove all over Britain. I came up here. I went up to Aboyne near Aberdeen to see Jock Hutchinson and Horseback UK. They were doing a lot of great work with veterans. I went to the military. I went to our own people in Whale Island. I went to the NHS. I went to therapists. And mostly I went to veterans. It was a packed 3 months. But it gave me a really good, clear impression of how we're dealing with this and what the scale of the problem is and all that sort of stuff. That was a starting point. And I just got back to Ibiza when my father-in-law collapsed and died of a heart attack. And I loved that man. He was as much as my own father, you know. It was a big shock. And once we got through that, it took about 3-4 weeks. Shirley stayed back here to look after her mum, who was quite ill. And I went back to Ibiza with Tom to finish his last term in his first school. And we went on leave. He broke up for the summer. And I fell apart. I started crying and I couldn't stop. And I cried for the whole of the summer. I showed him where the pizzas were in the supermarket. I showed him how to use the card. And we lived on pizzas for 4 months. And he was brilliant. He was only 13. I said, for God's sake, don't break anything. I can't do with any more stress. Because he was into skateboarding. He was doing all this aerial stuff. I was frightened the hell out of me. He didn't break anything, bless him, you know. I think I made the bed twice. Didn't do anything else. Just cried and cried and cried. And I cried for everybody that should have been grieved for but wasn't, which is my parents, my grandparents, uncles and aunts, many, many people in the Corps, even people as far back as my grandmother, who collapsed on me when I was 5 years old. She died of a heart attack. That was my first experience of death. Because for about 27 years, every single morning, I used to wake up and I used to go Bob Leeming, Pete Fitton, Andy Uren, Keith Phillips, rest in peace. Those are the 4 guys we killed in the Blue and Blue. And that was just a mantra that just became automatic. And around about the 27-year point, I suddenly became aware of the fact that I'd stopped doing it. So I think it just naturally petered out. There was no planning involved in any of this, it just evolved. So I think that's where that ended. And it took something like my father-in-law's death to actually trigger off all the other grieving. So when my mother-in-law finally joined us for the last part of her life, on the 30th of September 2013, I had to get my act together. You know, I had to arrange all the hospital stuff for her and the oxygen bottles and all the bits and pieces, and picked up the life. And so started getting into this whole business of what do I do to help veterans, right? Well, I've got all that information of the 3-month recce. What do I do with it? And so I started building the program and serious analysis and research and so on. In 2014, I started looking for the money. And I've got a lot of good connections, mostly former Royal Marines, of course. It's a wonderful network, and somebody put me in touch with somebody I trained, and a guy called Don Morehouse, who is now a very successful entrepreneur. His story is interesting, and he's a top guy. And I rang him and I explained what I was doing, and Don was, oh, great to hear from you. How are you doing and all that stuff? You know, so I gave him the 5-minute version of my life, which lasted about 2 hours. And so he said, well, how much does it cost to put one bloke through your program? Which, bearing in mind, I hadn't even done a pilot at this point. So I plucked a figure out of the sky. I said, well, about $3,000. He said, well, how does 9 sound? Blimey. Right. But what about the accounting and receipts and things? Oh, don't worry about it. I said, I know you. Just go and do it.
Yeah.
What a gesture. Fantastic, eh?
Yeah.
And that's how it started. So then I started looking for people to help, and I came up here, and another guy I'd worked with, Ian Hopkins, who'd been in my troop when I was in Camacho. Mm-hmm. He was now running a thing called the Coming Home Centre in Govan, which has been run by somebody else now. But and he said, yeah, we've got plenty of people up here. He said, some of them have definitely got PTSD. So I came up to Govan. They were in Cathcart, actually, in the church there at the time, before they moved down to the Pearce Institute, where they are now, right on the banks of the Clyde, on the top floor, if anybody's interested. Get yourself up there. It's a good organisation. And I gave a presentation, 2, in fact. In fact, the first one was in the morning, then we adjourned to sort of the annex of the church for lunch. There was a nice group of ladies there cooking everything. And it was quite bizarre. I sat there eating my pie and chips, and there were 4 blokes right behind me, sort of looking over my shoulder. They weren't saying anything, they just stood there, Hello, can I help you? And these are the guys that wanted help. Yeah. And so we selected a guy from that we thought was probably the easiest case, a former gunner called Edward. And suddenly things were moving fast. So, right, do the admin, book the flights, get myself out to France and actually go and see the ground I've been planning this on. I've been doing it for a year on Google Earth. Because when I woke up that first morning and actually saw the mountains, oh my goodness, these are huge. Right, I've got to rechange everything. I had 10 days to rewrite the program before it had turned up. And he came in September 2014, and he was the first guest to go through. And it was, talk about swag. You know what that means, swag. Scientific wild ass guess. Not a lot of real science involved. It was like that, and I was very conscious of the fact, as they say, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and I'm a complete amateur. I'm not trained in anything to do with psychological solutions, or mental health problems. But I kept referring back to my own experiences and thinking, well, this is valid to me. And I know those people I spoke to in 4-5 and all those people I spoke to on the recce, I was touching a nerve there. I was definitely getting their empathetic sort of, flow of information. And I felt, no, it's a good starting point. Well, it was far better than that, actually. I managed to turn him around. But it was only a 10-day program then. It's since evolved and it's grown to a bigger program now, and it's much more, it is fully effective. And that's how it began.
Yeah. Fully effective, so you've got 100% sort of treatment rate.
That's an interesting question, because I'm often asked that, what's your success rate? It sounds very melodramatic to say this, but the only way I really think I can put this is that everybody that's qualified for the program, and there is an assessment, because this is not suitable for everybody. We have to make sure the right person comes on this program. I'll explain that a bit in a minute. Everybody that's come onto the program and gone through it has certainly entertained suicidal thoughts in quite a few cases, and I don't know the statistics, I could work it out, has actually attempted it. And they're all still alive. And I would say they're all thriving. Now, to an outward-looking person, that might not be the case. You've got a chap who's actually got his finances sorted out. He's on benefits, right? He hasn't got a moral conscience problem about, I'm leeching off the system, or me, the taxpayer. That's not an issue for him. He's got accommodation sorted out. Actually, they're doing quite well. There's a guy I know not far from here who's got a nice house, a better house than I've got. He's actually got a brand new car. Didn't dare tell my wife about that one. So, okay, he's sorted. But he's lazy. He's overweight. And he's mithering about, and I said, well, get your arse into gear. Here's a program for you. I'll help you as much as I can. So, that in my view, isn't really success. But then I've always felt that if your aim in life is to sit on a beach, and all you ever do is sit on a beach, your life's been a roaring success. So it's not down to me to determine what success is. That's down to the individual. That's your right, your privilege as well. So as far as I'm concerned, he is successful. He feels it anyway. So that's the only way I can measure it in terms of success. But I had an experiment during the COVID period, because I was getting quite worried about the fact, first of all, I couldn't move around because we were all locked down and all that sort of stuff. So we had to create solutions for that. We had a UK team I'd set up. It was all done online, of course, which is nowhere near as effective. You've got to be face-to-face with these things. I tried my best, and I thought, well, what about these guys that got other additional problems, like alcoholism, drug addiction, and that sort of stuff, any form of addiction, really. So I had to go with that, and I proved to myself it doesn't work, unfortunately, because whatever the addiction is will always be the priority. And unless they can deal with that issue, there's no way they can deal with the PTSD stuff as well. And I know that if you talk to Alcoholics Anonymous, they'll say the opposite. They'll say, well, deal with the PTSD first, then we can deal with the alcoholism. So the two, we're saying the same thing, but diametrically opposed. The only solution I can see is to try and do both in parallel. But that's going to require much more facilities than we've got. You're going to need a proper residential place and the right people on site. And, it's just me in the mountain way at the moment, so it's beyond our capability. So those are the kind of people really who are not suitable. But our basic tenet is we cannot help anybody that is not prepared to help themselves. And I make it quite clear from the beginning, this is not a panacea, and it's not an aspirin or a plaster stuck on a wound. We're sincere, absolutely sincere about achieving success here, but you're going to have to be involved as much as me. I will give you, I can't say 100%, because the only people that do that are the guys who die in Heartbreak Lane on a 9-mile speed march. Literally collapse and die, They've pushed 100%. Well, most of us never come near 100%, but I guarantee I'll give you my best effort. I expect you to do the same. So this is not just a turn up and attend course. You've got to be actively involved. And the build-up period, it's a minimum of 2 months, but in practice, it's a lot longer. The longest it's been so far and had a successful outcome is 3 years. But I've got people on my board back in the office who've been up there for years. And I just keep thinking, well, someday, they might decide. They might finally get their act together, mentally. So, nobody's written off. The door's always open. But you have to come in on our terms. And you've got to convince us before we spend about £4,000 on you and take up a lot of time that somebody else could have, possibly more deserving. You've got to qualify for this. And you might say, well, that's an artificial way of creating success, because you're only going to select the people that will be successful. Yes, that's true. But I'm not really focused on statistics and all that stuff and graphs and everything else. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm only concerned with the person I'm helping. And if I can help him and I won't commit until I know I can, then that's good enough. So, what's our success rate? Yes, it's 100%.
Do you think the people that you help, you've got a better chance of helping them because they genuinely respect you as a person? I know that when I speak to people and I've got issues, if it's someone that I don't respect, I don't really listen to them. But see if it's someone I know is an effective manager or is effective at whatever I'm trying to learn, and they tell me something, I'll probably be more likely to listen.
That's a really good question, Harrison. Thank you for asking that one, because that enables me to explain this more. Respect. I think one of the elements that makes the Mountain Way not just unique but effective is that I speak 2 languages. I speak military and I speak PTSD. Now, your professionals obviously speak PTSD in the way that they're trained, but they can't normally speak military as well. And you might think that's a small point, and really, is it relevant? It's absolutely relevant. Because when a guy's struggling to actually get to a meeting that he's been waiting for months, and he's got to be on time, and you might think that's nothing. It's a big thing to some of these guys, men who can't get out of bed. He gets there, and then the bloke's saying, hang on, I've got to stop you. What's a Chinook? It's a helicopter with 2 blades on it. Oh, God, I've lost my... What was I saying? Bollocks. And they walk out. They've got no tolerance whatsoever. So you see, they're stumbling. And of course, once they've been through that once, then the next time it's worse, because they're expecting it, they're anticipating, they're looking for it. They're looking actually for an excuse to not do this. You see, it's almost like 2 halves of a human being. I'm not suggesting we're schizophrenic, but we all have this, don't we? Yeah. We all have a permanent argument going on in our head, no matter what we're doing. Shall I go to the shops now or go later? No. What have I got to do? No, I can leave that. That kind of thing is going on. Well, in the PTSD context, do I really want to talk to this guy? Not really, but I've got to, because that's the only thing I've got. I don't believe in it. The more they go into it, the harder that gets, till eventually, and then that's it, 1 step from death. Yeah. So you've got to break down that cynicism, which is absolutely necessary for them to survive. Well, it's not survival, it's inevitable. And this is why it takes a long time. I have to build the trust. So the very first time I talk to anybody, because we're established now and there's a website and things like that, and obviously the word's got out a bit, generally people know something about me before we even talk. But usually when that first conversation happens, I'm thinking, oh, here we go. Got to load up the phone, because I know this is going to go on and it does, for maybe 3 hours. And I'm trying to get them onto WhatsApp, because that's free. Yeah. I'm trying to husband money all the time, but I can't stop them. So, hello, my name's Andy. Off it goes. Yeah, you just listen, and it all comes tumbling out, because they just need to talk, and it's usually a jumbled mess. You get a kind of scatty feeling about. I can guess what the issues are, but I would say about 75%. Another swag. I've got problems that began in childhood. So, in my opinion, there's no point just cherry-picking the things you can deal with. You've got to look at the entire holistic problem, because otherwise you're just playing at this. And the interesting thing about the childhood stuff, and I'm talking of abuse of various forms, and it comes in lots of forms, obviously, usually that is really difficult to uncover, because they've buried it. They've found a way of surviving, and their natural behaviour as a result of whatever the abuse was. If you're talking about females, and we're not focusing on females per se, although we have tried to help female veterans, if there's any kind of sexual abuse in their life, their subsequent behaviour patterns is usually generated by that. So they become, drama queens and nymphomaniacs or whatever you want. But
not normal behavior, because there's something they developed as a child when they weren't even able to understand what was going on as a defense mechanism. And unless they're enabled to understand that at some point in their adult life, that will never change. And I think there are so many problems that are deeply rooted that go back through the generations, that have trickled down through those families and just cast on to the next generation. And PTSD is a classic example. I mean, one guest I helped, his mother was appalling. And it turned out she wasn't his mother at all. He was 14 when he discovered she was his aunt. And the reason she was so violent was because her father had been violent. And the reason he was violent is because he'd been torpedoed twice in the North Atlantic by the Germans.
Jesus Christ.
And drink was the only way of dealing with it. And the two things came together, and he was a wife beater and so on. Now, that didn't change the circumstances, but what it enabled him to do was to actually understand the reason why she was like that and to forgive her. And that was as far as you can go. But it's an essential point, because suddenly all the residual anger that had been there all his life, there was no need for it anymore.
Yeah.
And it just vanished. And I tell you what, it's amazing how quickly these things can turn around. Once the light bulb comes on and they see the light, oh my God, I never thought about that. You're just opening up a box that they've already had, but they didn't know how to open it. And this stuff comes out. So it's, the old BT slogan, it's good to talk. That's absolutely right. That's all you got to do here. But it has to be in the right environment, with the right person, and at the right time. And if you can get those things lined up, then, success is pretty much guaranteed.
Do you think within the military now it's got better, the treatment, or do you think it's still not where it needs to be?
Well, the Royal Marines is great at being at the front of many, many things. And one of the things the Corps can take credit for is a thing called TRIM, Trauma Risk Management. But TRIM isn't a solution to PTSD. TRIM is a way of identifying the potential for it, or the existence of it. So it's a good step forward. It's a great step forward. But now I've talked to guys who've actually been through it, I realise that the practitioners are not necessarily fully understanding how to do it. And that will obviously vary from unit to or case to case, of course it will, but it's the start point. But so what treatment is available? Well, you've got cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, you've got eye movement desensitization reprocessing, EMDR, you've got neuro-linguistic programming, you've got hypnotherapy. That's about it, really, and hypnotherapy isn't really in that sort of cabal of NHS-approved methods. Neither is NLP now, apparently. So you've only got those two, CBT and EMDR. Now, those work. There's no doubt about it. But from what I've seen, and I've not personally experienced either of them, but I've bought the dummy's book for CBT and read up and all that sort of thing, I have a sort of reasonable knowledge. They're not adequate enough for people who've got what I call complex military PTSD. Complex military PTSD is not a recognised term. It's the one I use to differentiate between somebody that's maybe been involved in a car accident or some similar trauma and the people we're talking about. Because one of the more interesting components now, interesting sounds a bit callous as well, but it does fascinate me, is the moral component. Why were we in Afghanistan when we ran away and we left all our weapons behind? We betrayed all our friends to the Taliban, who have now been murdered, of course. All that kind of stuff, Only last night I was having this conversation. What was it all for? Why did my mates lose? We were up at the memorial celebrating 2 Royal Marines, or that's not the right word, remembering, who'd committed suicide as a result of what they'd experienced in Afghanistan. So you've got that moral component. Now, doctors probably have it sometimes, but I should think they learned how to cope with that one. You're dealing with a life and death situation. A patient dies under your knife. You're bound to feel something. Of course you are. You'd be inhuman not to. But I sincerely hope that the medical profession know how to cope with all that. But there is no other category of personality that suffers from this iniquitous problem that has to deal with this extra moral component as well. So do they understand? Yes, they probably do, but are they capable of dealing with it? No, they're not. You see, our program is made up of lots of components, and all I can say is that the experience, which is the culminating point before they move into the post-traumatic phase where we are with this current guest, which is open-ended and can be anything, that's 15 days. That's 360 hours. I'm with the guest. I'm separated from my family. I'm up in the mountains in the summer. I'm on Ibiza in the winter. I'm on call the whole time. Now, 360 hours, I want to put this into context because people sometimes say to me, how many people do you help a year? I said, the maximum I can do, and I did it 2 years ago, is 5. But that 5 times 2 is 10 months. That means I've got 2 months to find all the money to pay for this. Until you try doing that, you have no idea how difficult that is. What about my family? And what about me? I haven't had a holiday for 12 years. I took 1 week off this Christmas because my daughter was across in Dubai. That's the only holiday I've had. I'm in that office every single day, no weekends, and I'm in there till midnight. So this is what it requires to run a charity single-handed of this magnitude. So I want to put this into context. If you were going to the Priory in London, for example, and I know that's a top-end example, but it's not that far above the average, for CBT therapy, go on their website, they're charging about £250 an hour. Now, you multiply that by 360 hours I spend in the programme, or the experience, that comes to £90,000, as opposed to £4,000, which costs us, not the guest. Actually, it's much more than that, because we do a preparation phase called Open Door, which I'll be doing at the end of this UK trip now in a week's time. I'm going down to Northampton, and the next guest, was a sailor in the Falklands on HMS Antrim, he's coming out to Ibiza on the 1st of June. The 3-day preparation phase is to finalise the programme to make it ready for him and all the rest of it. So there's 3 times 8, that's 24 hours you can add on to that. Then there's umpteen Zooms, which never last less than 2 hours and sometimes much longer.
Yeah.
Add it all together, it's a lot of time. And that's what it takes to actually help these people get to the point where they can actually deal with it, which no therapist can do. It's impossible. If you were to take that 360 hours and go to a therapist on the basis of 1 hour per week, it would take you 6 years and 11 months, where we do it in less than 2 months.
It's pretty
So that
wild,
puts into context.
Yeah.
This is why it's bloody good value. It's excellent value. But the final point is, how much is a human life worth? Give me a dollar figure. What is your life worth? £100, £1 million, 10 million? Exactly. There is no figure, is there?
Yeah.
So, it's stupid to even consider what it costs. It's irrelevant. All that matters is we've got the money, we can actually do it.
Yeah. It's a pretty incredible purpose to have. We have a closing tradition on the podcast. I'd love to keep you here longer, but I'm nervous of time.
Lunch, yeah, I need my chips.
We have a closing tradition on the podcast. And I think with yourself, it would be interesting to know, what is the biggest lesson you've learned in terms of your PTSD and how to deal with that?
Good question. What's the biggest lesson I've learned? You should have emailed that to me. I could give you a really thoughtful process. I don't want to rush into this. What's the biggest lesson I've learned? There are so many, to be honest, Harrison. But I suppose the first one that comes to mind is quite simply, my life and my health is my responsibility. Not the responsibility of the NHS or therapists or anybody else. It's down to me. If I'm not prepared to do something about it, why should I expect anybody else to do it? So, I think it's that simple decision. If you want a quality of life, it's there. If you want it, go and get it. Stop whining about it. Don't find excuses. One of the things I do in the process, in the post-traumatic phase, which is basically we've done as much as, we've taught them how to meditate, how to use guided reflection and cognitive reframing. Those are the 3 main principles. Very, very simple tools. Is to say, look, we need to draw a line in the sand. And at the end of the experience, we have a resolution ceremony. Now, in the Pyrenees, it's obviously on top of a mountain. We go to a thing called Salvaguardia. It's 9,000 foot high. And I don't just encourage them, I make them think hard about it and do something significant. So I want you to build something. I want some artistic involvement here. And that's one of the things we do. Do you want to learn guitar? I'll teach you guitar. You want to learn how to paint? I'm crap at that, but we can have a go.
Try it.
Sculpting in clay, anybody can do that. It's wonderful. You'd be surprised what you can achieve, Any kind of thing like writing poetry. The current guy has written some fantastic poems. I'm going to put them together in an anthology, and I'm going to do it on Kindle, Amazon, get it out as a book. It's too good to be stuck in a drawer somewhere, And it's surprising where these things go. I mean, one guest I took through some years ago started making poppies. And that's exploded. I said, mate, you're sitting on a gold mine. You need to get into America because, honestly, seriously, this is big. He hasn't got it. He ain't going that far. It's a shame. I'm frustrated. God, blimey, you could raise millions for me. Why don't you do it? He hasn't taken the hint yet, But anyway, the artistic thing is what I call the Zen warrior. I want you to leave the naffy fighting mentality behind. I want you to explore, for want of a better phrase, your feminine side. I want you to explore other things. Let's get over yourself. Let's get rid of this macho mentality. It's stupid, There's nothing wrong with crying or talking about your emotions as long as you're not whining all day. Explore the science, or not science, the artistic side, but everything else is related to that. Because otherwise you're not progressing. Your life stopped when you left the military at the age of 40-something, and it's not going to go any further. And you've still got the bulk of your life ahead of you. What a waste. Yeah. So it's all that kind of stuff.
So the resolution is a big thing. And I was very wary about symbolism and is it effective? Am I just going down the hippie road here? No, definitely not. After 12 years, I know for a fact this is important. I use a lot of symbolism. I mean, the River Garonne, when we go down to the Pyrenees from Toulouse, we cross this broad river. We have a picnic and we go swimming in it. This river represents a barrier between your old life to the north and your new life starting in the south. We're taking all this negative stuff, this crap to the top of a mountain, and we're throwing it off, physically throwing it away. You know, I'm doing it abroad because it's not in your home, it's not in your hometown, it's not even in your country. So there's no reference points to it here in the future. Because what I want you to do is draw this line in the sand in time and say from this point onwards, I'm no longer blaming PTSD. If I have a silly tantrum, it's down to me, mate. You own it, accept it. You know, you're a knob. You know, get a grip. You know, have a little word with yourself. But don't use that as a crutch, an excuse, because that's what people do.
Yeah.
People get comfortable with it. And I think there's more than hypochondria involved in here. You know, people who actually go to the doc too often and too many pills. It's an easy way out, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not. I'm saying own it. Be the human. Be the person you want to be. Be the person you used to be. Because when you joined up, that's exactly what you were. You've lost it somewhere, really. Yeah. So I think that's the thing I've learned mostly from this is just to accept the responsibility you've got, but also the fact that it's there if you want it.
Yeah.
You know, my life is fabulous. Yeah. Not merely because I live in Ibiza. That's a consequence of the PTSD.
That's pretty fabulous.
But it is because that's right, exactly. You know, I've got nice neighbours. I've got none of the stresses that people normally associate with life. I really haven't. It's a very relaxed, laid-back place, completely tranquil, perfect for me, as well as all the usual things, the sun and the sea and all that sort of stuff, you know. But it took some effort to get there.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm saying to these guys, make the effort and get your life back on track again, you know.
Yeah. Well, listen, Andy, I think, you know, from what I've kind of gathered in this conversation, you were looking for purpose, and that's why you entered the Royal Marines. And then subsequently from the Royal Marines, you were looking for a purpose, and you've found one of the most incredible purposes I can think of, which is helping others. So seriously, that's absolutely inspirational. And people listening to this, I'm sure, will be majorly inspired by you. So I can't thank you enough for coming in. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Harrison. Those are very nice words. Thank you. So you've summed it up so perfectly. We didn't need to talk for 2 hours, did we? You could edit all that stuff out.